Today we're going to talk about morality, but because I love this graphic and because it is basically the summary of everything, how we position everything in classical apologetics, I want to start with this again. And also just to show what classical apologetics is. Um, Truth, theism, Christianity. It's a building block system. There are other methods of doing apologetics that are different. Some of them are just different in strategy. So, for example, we point out that someone can say, all right, I believe everything in the New Testament actually happened, but I still don't believe God exists. There's just another explanation for it. So that's why we say, well, start back here, truth, God exists, and then Christianity is true. Some people will say, no, start with trying to prove the resurrection, and if you do that, then God must exist. But it's crazy. There are actually PhD people, so you think they'd be smarter than to say something like this. But someone will demonstrate historically that Jesus rose from the dead, and they'll say, well, it's just some principle of nature we haven't discovered yet. They actually will say that as a cop-out to accepting the truthfulness of Christianity. So that's why we say, well, we've already talked about God existing. We've proven that. So by the time you get to the resurrection, it's, well, Jesus rose from the dead, and the best explanation is that God did it. Because he said God was going to do it, and everyone went around saying God did it. We already know God exists. So if God didn't do it, he would have done something to stop that message, I guess you could say. So that's one difference in how to do apologetics. The other one is something called the cumulative case, and it just means sort of a potpourri. Go and do a little proof here, a little proof there. There's no real connection between them, but you start to have so many mini proofs of little bits of Christianity that you overwhelm the person into, fine, okay, Christianity is true. Which, okay, that's not that bad. It's just that what we're saying is this is a syllogism. If this, then this, then this. So by the time you get to the resurrection, it's the conclusion of everything you've already done. It's called the 12 points, which are the 12 points in the booklet there. It's called classical apologetics. This is a little more fleshed out way of doing classical apologetics. But we just think that as you watch how people respond to our sharing our faith and defending our faith, this is just what works best, and it's also what happens. It has to be this way philosophically or logically, right? Christianity can't be true if there's no truth, and so on and so forth. The only one that we will say doesn't belong on the playground, as I like to say, is something called presuppositionalism. And that's the one that says you have to assume all of Christianity, all 66 books, every doctrine, the Bible is 100% true before you can have any knowledge of anything at all. So you go to the atheists and they say, well, I don't believe in Christianity. And your response would be something like, well, you couldn't even believe that if Christianity wasn't true. And the atheist looks at you and says, what do you mean? And they literally will deny that they have knowledge about things like reality, science. I think I shared that one quote in here about the trees. You can't see trees correctly. That's something that we in the church have to be aware of. I hope this class is a way that all of us will get used to smelling that. If we start smelling presuppositionalism and the way somebody phrases something, just like, whoa, wait a second, you probably don't mean this, but just to clarify, you're not saying that people have to believe in Christianity before they can believe in Christianity, are you? Because that's what presuppositionalism, and it's super tied to this idea of the fallen mind can't understand anything, including mundane things like nature and science and philosophy and history, which doesn't seem to be the way that God talks to people. He talks to people in the Bible, even people who end up rejecting him, as though they do understand these things, and he can reason with them, even if they're going to reject them. So I'll just say that. The 4 questions we won't go over because you should know that right now. That's just the outline of the book. Okay. This is going to be some extra credit because we didn't actually, we're not going to talk about number 4 and 5. But I wanted to share this because there are actually a guy named Alvin Plantinga, a Christian philosopher, a couple decades ago, I think it was, just sat down. He's a brilliant man. I don't agree with everything he says. He's got some things I think that are off, but really smart. And he just sat down and just started jotting down ideas of, well, you could prove God this way, you could prove this way. And he came up with 22 different proofs, ways to prove that God exists. And he just kind of put it aside and said, oh, that was interesting. So other people found this list. He's still alive, but they discovered that he wrote this list and built entire doctoral dissertations on one of those proofs. That's how brilliant this man was. It's like, what? You just kind of threw this aside like, yeah, no big deal. This is brilliant. So I just want to say that there are a lot of good lines of reasoning and argumentation to prove that God exists, that Christianity is true. The three that we focus on, I think, are the best because they have the longest tradition. They're more difficult for non-believers to refute. The other ones are a little bit more. Some of them are artsy-fartsy. Some of them are esoteric. You know, it's hard to follow. So that's why most people stick to these three arguments. But I wanted you to be aware of a couple of things. Number one, sometimes we make the mistake of saying the cosmological argument for God's existence, singular. The cosmological family is actually a family of arguments for God's existence. And when we did it, if you remember, we did you do that one? Cosmological?
Yes.
I think you did, okay.
We also did a little bit of ontology in there, because it's kind of...
Oh, you did the ontological?
No, well, in terms of looking at the metaphysics of being...
Okay,
just
so
touched on it, but...
the vertical and the horizontal a little
Yep.
bit. Okay. So what he was covering is the fact that there are at least two different versions of the cosmological. There are three to be aware of, though. There's the one that we call the kalam, which means there was a beginning, so there has to be a cause to the beginning. If anything comes into existence, something caused it to do that. That's the main one that most people call the cosmological. But then there's the Thomistic, which we would call the horizontal, saying that existence right now needs a cause. And that's what we talked about, the holding in the air, God being existence itself. He's who we get our existence from. That's actually a cosmological argument. And then there's something called the Leibnizian, just named after a guy named Leibniz, an old philosopher that no one remembers unless you're in philosophy. And he basically said that it's similar to the Thomistic in that, say you were to come along and you found a glowing orb in the field somewhere. It's not enough to say, well, I guess that it's always been there. You say no, its existence in a place, just its existence calls for an explanation. It's saying that you don't erase the need to need the explanation just because the glowing orb we're talking about is the universe. Making it bigger doesn't make it less necessary to explain it. Does that make sense? So it's more of a using a what do you call it? Just a definitional approach. It's not as powerful. That's why people don't use it as much. But it is something to be aware of. I just say these things to point out there is more to learn, and it's really cool. There are so many different ways to know that Christianity is true. We're just covering kind of the surface of the arguments, which I think is more than enough to demonstrate that Christianity is true. There's a lot more to know. It's really cool studying this stuff. So also, the ontological argument I won't go into, but ontology just means being or existence in Greek, and so ontological means you're arguing for God because of the fact that things exist that aren't necessary. The ontological argument. The one I really wanted to focus on, though, was something called the aesthetic argument, the argument from beauty. So if beauty is objective, then God must exist. Since beauty is objective, therefore God exists. I bring this one up because it's similar in structure to the moral argument that we're going to go through tonight. In that, if someone were to come along and say, let's say the cosmological argument from the beginning, and they say, oh, I don't think that the universe has a beginning. Okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's look at the scientific evidence, the philosophical. You're talking about objective things, right? You're not going to say, the second law of thermodynamics shows that the universe can't be eternal in the past because the energy would have ran up by now. Well, that's just your artistic interpretation. No, it just is the second law of thermodynamics. We're talking about objective math and observable science and things like that. So that's why it's more easy to share with somebody, because you're both looking at nature, you're both looking at reality, and it's an objective object of inquiry. But if you start talking about morality, what's the first thing people start to say? That's just what you believe, right? Yeah. Well, you start getting in anthropology, they'll say the lie that says, every culture has a totally different set of moral norms, and it's just subjective to that culture. It's actually not true. There are some actual moral codes that do transcend all cultures. Like, it's not morally acceptable to eat people for food. Cannibalism is never about diet. It's about showing power and power over your neighboring tribes. So even in cannibalistic cultures, it's not a dietary preference. Not chicken, not beef. I like people. It's considered wrong. Or it'd be some like witch doctor eating their soul. If you eat the body of your enemies, that's like eating their soul and therefore absorbing their power into you. Nothing to do with diet. So that is actually something that's universal across all cultures. It's never found a culture in all time where eating people for food was good. So even when anthropologists say that, they're not being entirely thorough. But it is hard when you say that morals exist, objective morals exist. That's where they can get you by saying, well, no, they're not objective. It's just, it's what we do to be able to thrive as a culture, or every culture is different. Look how, Amsterdam has prostitution that's legal, but we don't. Oh, well, whatever, doesn't matter. Drugs are legal in some countries and not illegal here. See how that's an example of morality that differs from country to country. So start pointing out all these differences, and it seems to undermine that second premise of the argument. So what do we say to that, is the question. So that's what we're going to go over tonight, but it's the same thing with beauty. That beauty is objective, is clear, because otherwise, my undergrad degree was film, like I always say. Why do we spend so much time arguing about whether that was a good film or not, or that scene was shot with excellence, or man, that was great how they lit that set, or the way the music score came in? We talk about all these different components of a film as though there's some objective goal of the artist that they met. Hey, good job, you really set the mood for that scene. Look at the, whatever. In the same school that was telling me that there was no objective morality or beauty or anything in the eye of the beholder, all that, they're also grading me and whether or not I got to that objective beauty in film, at least. And the art class is the same thing. What are you judging me for? What, poetry and literature? I mean, what are you testing me on, if it truly is subjective? So no one acts like its beauty is subjective. They just talk like it's subjective. Well, it's the same with morality. And kind of had a little bit. C.S. Lewis had a famous thing where he said the person who says that morals are relative, that same person, this is his word, his example, if you walk up and were to slap him in the face, would suddenly object. And he would say, why are you objecting? Why'd you slap me? Felt like it. I don't know, do I have to have a reason? It's just, a thing I did. He says, and no one acts like morals are subjective and not binding, but they like to say it. So there's a difference. And the bottom line there is we know that we believe in objective morality based on our reactions to things, people's reactions to things. My goodness, man, our culture that tells us no, that morals are not objective are the same ones that are like protesting everywhere and shouting people down and won't let speakers speak at commencement ceremonies because they disagree with their views. What do you care if their views differ from you if there's no such thing as right and wrong? So no one acts like it's not the case, but they like to say it when it comes to them doing their own thing, basically. Okay, so we'll get into it. Any questions up to here from past weeks or anything else?
I actually had that argument today with my nephew.
Really?
He's 22, about morality. And we argued back and forth about whether it's, I have no idea what we're talking about tonight.
Perfect then.
What could his argument possibly be?
That there is not, that it is relative, that morality is relative. So I pulled out is it always wrong to murder babies for fun. I can't remember where I got that one from. Somebody else.
Craig uses a lot, Craig Turk, yeah.
Turk,
Usually they
yeah,
say
Turk.
torture babies.
Yeah, torture.
Yeah,
but
torture
I
for
didn't
fun,
remember,
either
yeah,
one.
for fun, and like, well, I think it's wrong, but other people might not believe that.
And they would be right or wrong.
And then I said, well, they don't believe it's wrong, so how can it be wrong for them? And I finally at least nailed him down to the fact that he was indeed arguing for that, you know, that murdering babies for fun is not wrong.
He actually acknowledged that.
Yeah.
Why do we have prisons then, is the next question.
Well, see, he doesn't believe in prison.
Okay, well, this is consistent. Usually we call those people sociopaths, and we do lock them up if they really don't believe anything's wrong and they're going to act on it. Once they start acting on it, it gets them in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he really believes that. I
know.
think I just pushed him into a corner.
What school does he go to?
He actually has picked all this up from CPCC. His speech, his public speaking class professor has got him believing all this stuff.
Because he's probably studied a lot of philosophy as a public speaking professor.
In fact, yeah, that's actually what got us into the conversation, because he was telling me about this incredible professor who knows all about Aristotle. And I was like, and I started asking questions, this guy don't really know about Aristotle. Because then, you know, I said, this guy doesn't believe in a single theistic God, you know, then he's not believing Aristotle, because Aristotle, yeah, but anyway, that's how we got on to it.
Yeah, he's talking about Aristotle's four causes.
So this stuff is being taught even at Central Piedmont Community College in a non-religion, non-philosophical class. It's being shoved down the throats of
Bill
kids.
Craig actually, I don't know if he surveyed this to know, but he said that you won't find relativism argued for in philosophy departments because they know that it's crazy. They're like, this doesn't hold up. But you will find it in literature and art classes. He says it's interesting. The very ones who study the subject matter know that this is really, you're not going to win this one if you go down this road. But it's only the ones who want to stick to bumper sticker level, maybe throw out Aristotle's name. Apparently that means that Aristotle agrees with you instead of actually arguing from Aristotle. Yeah, I had a poetry professor like that in undergrad. Oh, she was a piece of work. It was interesting. Yeah, so I mean, there's a good case that the stuff that we're talking about here in this class, it really is out there, and it really is waiting for people when they either go to college or just start interacting with the world. We're not making this stuff up. It sounds like we are sometimes. Like, why even have to argue about this? Because people are out there saying the opposite, and it's very scary if they get their way. I'm not going to rehash the other arguments. Sometimes there are several weeks in between these classes, so I rehash them. Moral argument, you can frame it different ways, but this is probably the most common one. If objective morals and values exist, then God exists. Objective morals and values do exist, therefore God exists. So you see that it follows necessarily. The reason this is a more difficult argument, the way it's framed this way, is it looks like you have to do some more explaining. Because, number one here, objective morals and values exist and God exists. Why? It's not apparent right away, so you have to unpack that a little bit more. This one here, it takes more work, but it's easier to show, like everything we talked about. Everyone really does believe in objective morals, even if they initially say they don't. But why is it you think that this is true? Or do you think that it's not true? It's a tough one, I think. Seems like you're trying to, if the sky is blue, then I'm right. The sky is blue, therefore I'm right. Kind of sounds like ad hoc. We're going to unpack that during the rest of the talk, of how can it be that morals are objective and that they exist if there is no God. So that's what the rest of this is. Another reason why I think the cosmological and the design, the teleological, are the best place to start, because you're not going to get into this relativism stuff right away. But if somebody's really passionate about certain things, then hey, go for it. You know, especially if they're super fired up about some cultural thing. Say, man, you're really hot about this. You think it's actually wrong for people to believe this thing that you're against? Yeah, I really do. Then, okay, well, how do you ground that? And you start talking about, you know, why do you think it's wrong for everybody at all times to be that way? Okay, you might remember, because it happened here in the Charlotte area, a series of campaigns that were trying to make the point. Can you see that? Why believe in a God, small g, just to, you know, punch us in the gut? Why believe in a God? Just be good for goodness sake. It was a series of ads that went out in New York. There were some here in Charlotte that were on the billboards. And they still do sometimes. They don't see them as much anymore, but this was about 8 to 10 years ago. Do you guys remember seeing any of these? There were some on 485, or was it 85 heading out? I can't remember where, but it was on that side of town, the west side of town. Things like this, basically saying, look, you don't have to believe in God to live a moral life, is the basic message of it. So the question, can we be good without God? How would you answer that?
No.
No, anyone else?
Can we be more without God or believe in God?
You've been trained somewhere.
I've been trained.
Yeah, where is this place that you've been trained? Is it the Jedi Temple?
Yes, we use the Force.
Yes. On the surface, it's really like you feel kind of, well, of course you don't have to believe in God to be moral. That's not what the question says. It doesn't say, can we be good without believing in God? So it's phrased in a way purposely to try and get people into a good conversation. But the point is, like, it should be obvious once we phrase it that way. Yeah, we don't believe that you have to be a Christian to live a moral life or be able to understand certain things are right or wrong. What we're saying is, if there is no God, then how do you say that was wrong? The Holocaust, or the 9/11, or the Boston City bombing, or, and unfortunately we keep getting these, the Las Vegas shooting. So how do you take any of those things? In every single case, the perpetrators thought they were doing good, or something neutral, morally neutral, right? Especially like the Nazis. They argued, they had a lot of literature describing why their project of erasing the inferior species was helpful to humanity in general. They were treating all of humanity like dog breeding. Just get the right traits that you want and breed out the bad traits. So they argued for it, and they're saying this is actually a good. So none of the people thought that they were doing evil. They thought that they were somehow serving a greater good, Allah or science or mankind or whatever. So what we're saying is, if God doesn't exist, then you can't really say any of these things were wrong or evil or immoral. And that's what we're going to talk more about. Excuse me. Just a heads up, we will get done early tonight. 2 weeks in a row. So,
3 weeks.
3 weeks too?
We were done early whenever.
So see, it's not just you. But I'll tell you, when we get to the New Testament stuff, there's no getting out early, because I can barely get through all that stuff, and because it's just so much to say, and it's great about the New Testament. It's true.
You ain't lying. I read that.
The New Testament stuff.
I read that this week. Again.
And that stuff, there's more since they wrote the book about how we can trust the Bible. So when we get to that point, it's going to be good. That's when we start to invite more people, right? By what standard do we measure Mother Teresa and Hitler? The chapter title is Mother Teresa or Hitler. So when we say, obviously, I hope it's obvious, that Mother Teresa wins when we're talking about in a moral fight with Hitler. But why? So what is the standard by which, in the book, I honestly think the book is a little bit unclear about this. I know Frank and I know Norm, I know both of them don't believe this, but the way they present it in the book is you don't quite get the depth of what they're saying. So, with their permission, I will tell you the depth of what they were trying to say. They were just afraid that it would be confusing to people, which I don't know why. Are we supposed to be like God? Are we measured against God? Because in the book it says God's unchanging holiness or unchanging nature is the standard by which mankind is measured. Is that true?
No.
No.
Exactly. But why?
I mean, I know an argument,
Because he didn't create us to be him, he created us to be us.
Yes. Perfect.
I mean, I know an argument against that. I mean, I don't
Go-
believe
go
it. Be holy, because I am holy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So is he saying, be pure actuality,
No.
be simple, be
He's not even saying be holy like I'm holy.
right?
It's just be set aside, because I am set aside.
It's the problem we get into when people like to take one verse, or worse, sometimes a prepositional phrase within a verse, sometimes one word. I mean, we truncate it now as much as we need to get what we want out of the Bible. But if you look at it in its whole context, right, that passage does not say, have all the attributes of God, just like I am God with all his attributes. There is no, he's constantly saying, who is man to presume to be like me in various ways? He's saying that. Read the book of Job, right? That's basically what God says to them when he starts to answer Job and his friends, all their accusations against him. I'm God, you're not. That's all I'm going to say. And he goes through all the reasons why they should believe in him as God. So, you hit it on the head. Okay, Adam and Eve were not like God. They weren't eternal, they were created. They weren't infinite, they could only be in one place at one time. In no way can you say that they were exactly like God. It says that God gave us his image, and then as it kind of talks about that in both the creation passage and then other places in the Old Testament, it means co-creators with God, but we don't bring things into existence ex nihilo. He doesn't even mean that with being made in his image. So I already have the answer up there, right? So what is the standard by which we're measured if it's not being like God? Like you said, be a perfect human is what he's saying. Adam and Eve were perfect human beings. There's a big difference between saying that and they were just like God. So the reason that's important for a lot of reasons is if God were the standard, nobody could ever do it. And God is just. So what is just about God saying, "Be like me"? That's impossible. Adam and Eve would have stayed alive forever if they had never sinned, and they would never have been like God, but they would have been alive forever without the curse. Why is that the case? It's because they were perfect human beings. They were. Remember the phrase we introduced last week, teleology, telos. It's the Greek word meaning end or purpose for which something is made. The teleology of a cow is in part to give milk. It's in part to die and feed the ecosystem. It's in part for beauty, eating grass. I mean, a cow has all these purposes for which it's made. So when it's doing those things, we said that's a good cow. That's what we mean by saying humans have a certain nature, a teleology, and when we look at a person like Mother Teresa and we say that's a good person, she's being a good human being. The very term humanitarian assumes that there's something called humanness or human nature that we're trying to be like. And so you get closer to that than Hitler. Congratulations, you're a better person. But of course the Bible says if you're just an inch off, it's enough to keep you out of heaven because we have to be perfect human beings. Otherwise, we're bringing any imperfections with us into heaven, right? So being a perfect human being is impossible post-fall, but it's not impossible in concept. Okay, that's the boring philosophical side of things. Are there any questions about that? Because now we're going to get into the fun part of why this actually matters every single day of our lives, especially in about 1 month from now, why it matters. And we'll tell you why. Any questions about any of that? Chart class, everyone's getting this stuff here. Okay. Let me ask you this question. Is the United States of America a Christian country, Christian nation? And if you were in those classes, you can't answer. So only the four of you can answer. So Alan, and Paulo, you can't say anything. Is the United States of America a Christian country, Christian nation?
Not anymore.
But it used to be?
Yes,
Okay, started out as a Christian nation?
it did.
Biblical.
The founding fathers did. I mean, you read
I
how
don't
they
know about
worded
Christian.
things, I mean, it's pretty obvious that they felt that way.
What do you guys say?
Said no,
I'm tipping
Biblical
into it.
nation.
Okay.
I mean, I know that beyond any doubt. Gouverneur Morris, who headed the Constitutional Congress. I mean, they quoted the Bible more there than anything else.
They actually didn't quote the Bible in the,
Not in the Constitution.
or
but
even
in
in the
meeting.
debates about it, but this is a twist. They quoted people like Thomas Hobbes and others who quoted the Bible more than anything. Now here's the thing, okay, because it sounds at first like, what do you mean we're not a Christian nation, right? Because it's not as bad as it sounds at first. It's actually way better. Why is it the founding fathers did not quote the Bible as proof text for the different things that they were trying to say, especially in the Declaration of Independence? By the way, how many founding documents do we have? No.
Founding document? One, the Declaration.
Okay. Well, Constitution is the.
Oh, yeah, okay.
But what you're saying there is right, because when the liberal side, politically the liberal side, tries to say that we were founded on the Constitution, well, they disagree with Abraham Lincoln. Because Abraham Lincoln says 7 years ago, our founding fathers set out to, 7 years ago from the day he gave that speech was 1776, July 4th. So Abraham Lincoln saw the Declaration of Independence as the founding of the nation. So I guess founding document, you could say that. So the answer to anybody out there that's trying to be all smart liberal or say, well, you can disagree, but I'm going with Abraham Lincoln on this one. I agree with Lincoln. You can give your reasons why you think he was wrong. Okay, so if the Declaration of Independence was our founding document, why is it the Declaration of Independence does not quote Scripture?
No, because it was taken from, they took it from natural law.
Yes. Why?
Oh, because,
Romans 1, 19, 20.
yeah, most of
They
the.
didn't quote Romans 1. They
No,
could
but
have.
that's why, right? Natural law, because it's evident to everyone.
If they formed a nation, not everyone, despite what we sometimes like to think, not everyone was born again. In fact, I would probably say the majority of the people probably were not. That's just, we're always going to be in the minority as Christians. So if they started a nation and quoted Scripture, then the people who are now governed by that document and ultimately the Constitution, and say the Constitution quoted Scripture, and those people were to say, well, I'm not a Christian, I'm a Hindu, I'm a Buddhist, I'm an atheist, and whatever. I mean, they did exist back then too. Not very many, but deists existed. And as you know, a number of the founding fathers, not the majority, but a number of them were deists or strange theists like Jefferson, who, it's actually a true story, it's not a myth. He has a Bible, I still have it, where he went through and he got scissors and he cut out every mention of a miracle. It's called the Jefferson Bible, because he did not believe that God could actually do a miracle in space and time, because he was a version of a deist.
I got a question about Jefferson. Should I wait until class?
If it's something I can answer, I don't know a ton about him, just little things here and there.
Well, no, he called himself a Christian, and he believed in the need of redemption in Christ, but he was still a deist and didn't believe in miracles.
He was a type of a deist, you're right. It's
Yeah.
hard to call yourself a
He is a type.
deist if you can write the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah,
which
and,
he did.
yeah, write the Declaration and believe in the need for redemption in Christ and,
Yep.
but he did not.
He was
like you said,
confusing. It was really confusing. Let's put it this way and be as charitable as we can. He was incredibly inconsistent in his beliefs. I do know one thing, the whole concept of separation of church and state, this is kind of getting off topic, but it'll come back around. The phrase separation of church and state comes from Thomas Jefferson. The context was the Danbury Baptists were trying to get him they were afraid of persecution. They were getting persecuted. And they were afraid of that, so they said, please pass a law making being a Baptist the state religion of Virginia, was it? And he said, no, that we can't do that. The government shouldn't be involved in that. There needs to be a clearing line between a line of separation between the church and the state. And then he got up after doing that, walked across to the Capitol building, went to a worship service being held in the United States Capitol. Apparently he didn't think that was a problem after just saying there needs to be a separation of church and state. So the way we're interpreting it in 2018 obviously is not the way Thomas Jefferson meant it. So that's a little nugget of history that I learned in the last couple of years, that even him cutting out all the miracles in the Bible and all that and phrasing separation of church and state, modern liberalism cannot look to him as a forefather. He would not have agreed with what is going on in our culture today. So back to, all the people who were not Christians, who did not think the Bible was the Word of God, including some people like Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and some others that were founding fathers. If this nation was founded on Christianity, then they could have said, well, I'm not a Christian, so why am I obligated to follow these laws? Right? The founding fathers saw that, and they're like, well, okay, we can't do that. Not only that, but who are we to break ties with the king? Because he hasn't broken any laws, British laws. So who are we to say that we're independent right now? Because if we just say because we wanna, then we form a new country. The people we're going to be governing over the next decades are eventually going to say, well, we don't want to be governed by you, and then they'll split off, and then it's just constantly, well, as soon as you just run with your leadership, you just form a new country. They didn't want that. So what is it that they said? Glad you asked. We hold these letters to be off the page. You already know the back part then. So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, clearly they're not atheists, right? They're not quoting Scripture. This is Romans 1, but they're not quoting Romans 1 as a proof text, so that the people who say they're not Christians can't get out of it. So what they're saying is, all right, it's self-evident. So, King George, you should see it. It's self-evident. The fact that you're not seeing it raises this up to a very egregious crime that you are committing against us. We're created equal by God, our Creator. And these rights are unalienable. They can't be changed by some arbitrary law of man. And so because you violated these things, you broke a law that's higher than British law. It's called natural law. And because you broke natural law, that's what gives us the moral authority and even the obligation to break ties with you. And we're going to form a country that's also under natural law. So the only way our subjects could ever rebel against us would be to what? Point out something that we violated in natural law. Which is why from the Declaration to the Constitution, they went to great lengths to make sure they didn't break natural law. What is true about you? Natural means not nature as in leaves and rainbows. And we think of natural in terms of being a naturalist as an outdoorsy person. That's not what it meant back then. It meant natural in the sense that because you are human, you know these things. It's obvious from all that's created that these things are true. Self-evident, he said. Romans 1 says God made himself known, made it apparent through the things that were made, Romans 1 and the Declaration of Independence. Interestingly enough, this is also why the Civil War didn't have the same moral authority that the Revolutionary War did. Because the Confederate States didn't point to some violation of natural law. It was actually the reverse. It was the abolitionists that were saying, listen, there's a natural law that's being violated here against a group of people. They're humans. They have human nature. And we're violating that. So that's what made the Civil War, because oftentimes people will say, well, why did the North have such a problem with the South wanting to secede? We had just done it decades earlier. We seceded from Britain. It's just another extension of that. This gets back to, because they were adamant that we don't want nations to keep splitting and splintering every time there's a disagreement amongst the people. They set up a process through the Congress and through the courts for people to bring about change legally without having to go to war to do it. And that's why that was the moral argument that the northern states were making, that Lincoln and others were making. Any questions yet? We're going to fast forward. The three main points or periods in our history: our founding, and the Civil War is sort of a negative example. And another positive example is Martin Luther King Jr. I think this is brilliant. Wouldn't you love it if the activists of today were as well read as Martin Luther King Jr. was? So look at this. So he's in jail, right? He is breaking laws, and he is encouraging everyone who's following him to break laws. He's a Baptist minister. He was an ordained Baptist minister. I'm not sure if he was Southern Baptist, but I think he probably was, because he was from the South. So I don't know the whole history of our. Yeah, I don't know if theologically, but he was a Baptist minister. This is like Preacher Mike telling us all to break laws and go to jail for it, as God wants you to do it. So he's in jail, and he says, you know, my fellow pastors are going to be like, what are you doing? This is against God. You're telling people to break the law. Isn't that unchristian? So he said, I have to give them a reason. Just like the Founding Fathers said, we can't just do this without giving a reason. Otherwise, it's not ethical. But it doesn't also help those who come after us to know what's what. So he says, well, what's the difference between a just and an unjust law? So the just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. I love this. He quotes Thomas Aquinas. When's the last time you saw that in a civil rights activist? Quoting Aquinas. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Does that sound an awful lot like our Founding Fathers? That's why the Martin Luther King Jr. civil rights efforts were effective, because he had the moral authority to do it. He had the philosophical authority, and he had a philosophically robust argument. Listen, guys, saying that my daughter can't drink out of that drinking fountain just because of the color of her skin is unethical, because it breaks God's law. Now you have to prove why. There's some other, are we a different species? Do we have a different nature? I thought there was a human nature. He's going right to these fundamental things that can't be violated. There's nothing about your nature that you can change. Even people who, well, since we talked about before class, even people who don't have both eyes are still human, right? Even people who are missing an arm or a leg are still human. So what is it about, there's something that you can't take away anymore and still call them human. And we can get into all that, like the philosophical description of holomorphism and all that cool stuff. But there are answers to how we know what it means to be human, even though these things seem to be accidental, like they don't seem to be necessary. 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, all that. But having a different pigmentation in your skin is not one of those things that without which it's accidental. Meaning, you could have white skin or dark skin. There are, I knew 2 actually in college, 2 African people of African descent, one woman, one man, who were albino. Okay, well, you're African American, but you're whiter than I am. You know, so now you're getting into, okay, you're getting all these things that are arbitrary about whether or not you're a human being, trying to separate people, and that's what MLK was saying. You guys, this is arbitrary. Try reading Aquinas and tell me where we're wrong. Of course, nobody was reading Aquinas but him, probably. This gets back to the argument that the Founding Fathers were making. The Founding Fathers believed in natural law, but they didn't dig in a lot into the classic philosophers like Aquinas and Augustine and these guys to find out why natural law is the case. They just said, well, natural law is the case, so let's build a country from it. They didn't have, I don't think, a real deep reason for believing in it. What I'm saying in the school I go to and most people, that studying Aquinas is where you get this deep, rich philosophy to defend this idea that there's a thing called human nature. And human nature is something that can't be changed, it needs to be protected. So, again, I wish we had people like this, not Oprah, who were trying to argue for racial equality. He had it. He hit it on the head. He wasn't a perfect man, obviously, but his argument was exactly right. He couldn't be more right than what he was saying, which is why he affected more change than any civil rights leader. It wasn't just because he was assassinated and people remember him. His message was true. So, to be clear, back to the original question, do you need God to be good? Is that what it was? So we're not saying that atheists can't be moral. They can. I do know some atheists that in some aspects of life, important ones, even like family life, being a good husband, father, whatever, they're better than some Christians I know. You know, they stay together and they stay faithful. We are not saying that atheists don't know what's right and wrong. Now, this gets back to what I started out with, presuppositionalism. I keep saying that word because I want you to hate the word. It's a long word, it's a bad word. Presuppositionalists will actually say that if they're consistent with their belief system, atheists actually don't know. Their minds do not work properly. Getting into the stuff that Martin Luther King Jr. and our Founding Fathers were saying, I would say the presuppositionalists, are they a different species? Like, how many species did God create? The elect and the non-elect? How is it we're able to procreate then? Every single person that marries another person has to be both elect and both non-elect? I mean, you get into some really absurdities, and they have weird answers for these things, but really, you're talking about a radical difference if you're saying that some people are unable to see what's right and what's wrong. The Bible doesn't seem to say that. You do know what's right and wrong. That's why I am condemning you, the Old Testament would say. Because there was believing Israel and unbelieving Israel. He didn't care which one you were. He was judging Israel because they knew what they were doing was wrong. Even if they weren't believers. They had to put their faith in Yahweh. Okay, we are saying atheists can't justify their morality. They can't give a reason why this or that action is right or wrong. They especially can't give a reason why humans should be treated any differently than any other animal in the animal kingdom. We're just the most advanced species, primates, right? And when they get, this is a good apologetic I didn't put in there, when they start to say, well, we have our intelligence and our language. That's what separates us from the primates and the lower animals, and that's what gives us this quote moral, what we call moral right to rule, and that's how we know not to murder each other and stuff like that. Okay, well, if intelligence is what gives us that right, then what you're saying is that the more intelligent a person is compared to another person, that person has some sort of moral right to maybe rule over that person as if they were a lesser human being or a lesser species. There are people who actually live that way. They're usually professors at universities. They literally think that they're the ruling class, right? You hear them talk about the ignorant masses, or your ignorant Christians, or ignorant religious people. That's what they're saying is, okay, I believe in this so much that I'm going to treat fellow humans like they're inferior based on their IQ or their intelligence or their educational level. the thing that gets monstrous about that is literally what that means is might makes right. So whoever's stronger intellectually, physically, politically, the whole Me Too movement, you would say, oh, so you guys are all Christians? No, we're not, we're feminists. Well, bad or good, men are stronger, so does that mean feminism should be false? That men should be able to do whatever they want to women? Well, no. Well, then why? And we would say because men were created to be a certain way, and women were created to be in a certain way, and that is supposed to be harmony, and man's supposed to protect and use his strength for that, not for anything else. So you get into all these things that they can't defend as atheists. So it's interesting that you can take cultural things off the headlines and say, the very thing you're really hot about right now and you're angry about, you're actually not far from the kingdom, the way that Jesus said. What you're saying is so close you don't understand that you need Christianity. I mean, that's what gives you that moral authority, or you need God to exist in order for that, excuse me, to be the case. We agree with atheists that some atheists live better lives than some Christians, and some who say they're church people have poisoned the teachings of Christ. Church history has often been immoral, unjust, and even overtly evil. Of course, they're going to bring up the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition and slavery and all. They're just going to throw all that out at you. So what do you say to that? Okay, well, Christians have acted sinfully. But you can't even call it sinful or wrong unless there is morality that's objective for you to indict them, in which case you believe in God. Because if there's no God, you can't say the Inquisition or the whatever, the Crusades, anything you want to point to in history that the church has done, quote unquote, the church. It isn't really wrong if there is no God. So, excuse me, that's the turnaround here. This is the jiu-jitsu move. Like, if you can demonstrate to somebody that this has to be treating each other, it's sort of like this: two people playing soccer in the game. One person trips another person, and the guy who gets tripped says foul. The other guy says, I didn't follow you. Well, what do you do at that point? You have two people of equal standing who have a difference of opinion, really. You need someone outside the game, a referee, to be able to be objective and throw the flag and say foul. God's that outside the game. So in other words, if we're only talking human to human, there's no winning this argument except for might makes right. The argument about what's right and wrong, how should we treat each other, how should we live, how should government relate to its citizens, all these different questions we argue about. It means nothing if there's no God, other than whoever's got a bigger gun is going to win that fight. In fact, some people even said this when the Cold War ended. It wasn't that free market capitalism or constitutional democracy is superior to atheistic communism. It's just that we won. We ultimately outspent them, and we had a bigger arsenal of weapons, and we just overpowered them. It wasn't that that this is true. This is the right way to organize humans in a society. It's just happened to be might makes right. So we're only saying that there are no moral or immoral. There's no such thing as moral or immoral, just or unjust, good or evil, unless God exists. So at the very least, if you have people you're talking to who claim to be atheists, and they start using words about just or immoral or this or that, say, look, you just don't use those words, because find some other word. I don't like it, fine, okay, but that's not immoral. As soon as they start talking about just or moral or evil or good, then they're going to be talking about God existing.
Or fair.
Well, fair would be kind of like just or unjust. Yeah, hey, that's not fair. What do you mean? That's back to those questions we brought up a few weeks ago. What do you mean by that? How did you come to that belief? Have you ever considered? These are ways of starting a conversation with somebody. You know where you want to go with it because you've studied all this stuff. You read the book. So you just start asking questions to get them to say what they believe. And you know eventually what they're going to say is going to contradict something that's said earlier. And then you just say, well, okay, you said this, but earlier you said this. So how do you live with that contradiction? Or it seems to be a contradiction. And so that is one way. Francis Schaeffer, you guys obviously know who he is, but have you ever read any of his books? He was real big in the 60s, 70s, and he died in 84, I think it was. he had this idea called deconstructing. So you are disassembling their worldview, and that's what apologetics does. Show them where you have no leg to stand on. But he said he was a pastor, actually, a really good philosopher for somebody who wasn't trained formally. He was trained as a pastor. He said, but once that person realizes that they're not standing on anything, and they begin to see that the way they've ordered their life is crumbling around them, really, he says you have to be loving to be there to kind of catch them. Like, okay, you just took the rug out from under their feet. Don't stand there and laugh when they hit their head on the ground. So that's where you get into the evangelism and apologetics have to be both together. If you're doing apologetics just to win arguments, then shame on you, right? Shame on us. If you're doing evangelism without apologetics, again, shame on you for not loving those people enough to prepare yourself by getting these things under your belt, a little bit more understanding, so that when they ask the questions, what you're going to do. How often do you share your faith where someone's just like, okay, let's pray? There's always some question, there's always some objection or pushback or something. All that is, as soon as someone asks you a question or challenges you back, whatever you say back is apologetics. It doesn't have to be fancy like this stuff, but it is apologetics. So you have to do both together. So when we take the rug out from underneath them, we're there to catch them, and we'll see that it's okay. It's actually a lot better than you thought it was. That worldview you had that you built up your life around, you see how it fell apart. But the real world, or not the Christian worldview, but the real world is actually way better than you thought. So let me tell you about that. You can see how that works. It doesn't always work like that. That's kind of a scripted, but in broad strokes, that is what we're doing when we're witnessing to people effectively, I think. So, can we be good without God? No. But because if God doesn't exist, there's no such thing as good or evil. 7:19. That was quick. Any questions, follow-up discussion? Favorite movie?
I heard an evangelist talking to church leaders one time, and he says, I'll win them and bring them in, but I'm not sticking around to skin them.
Great way to look at people, right? He was in upstate New York by any chance, was he? In the 1800s or something?
Well, he would have fit in that.
He would have been in that.
Yeah, he would
mold,
have fit in
yeah.
there.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with there are offices in the church, and some people are called to be evangelists, but I don't think Paul ever would have said that. Like, hey, I'm here to win people to Christ. I don't care what they have, what happens after that. Actually, he did the opposite. He stuck around as long as it took, didn't he, to get the church established. So I do think that it's not really what we're talking about tonight, but I love altar calls. I came to Christ walking up from an invitation, so I'm totally cool with it. But I think that we have this culture in our church, and I mean our church and then in the church in general, that when someone walks up, that was the end goal. Like, yes, someone came to Christ. And we have a follow-up in the room to decide. We might plug them into a life group, and that's kind of it. I know that's not what we really believe when you press the matter. But why is it we count things like salvations and baptism as though they're more important than lives lived well, lives turned around? I think it was China or India, there was a missionary that went to a very hostile culture, had a single convert in his entire ministry. It was decades that he was there. I wish I remembered the guy's name because it's a good story. Was he a failure? But he was faithful. But what happened after is the missionaries that came after him, he had tilled that soil so much with zero fruit. He didn't see a single salvation. The next round of missionaries that came by, suddenly they were like, I know a little bit about this, tell me more. So then people started to come to the Lord. So clearly everybody would say, no, that was a success. But can you imagine him writing prayer support letters home? Hey, continue to support us, absolutely zero fruit. Not a soul came to Christ. No, I mean, we're really good in American Christianity at commoditizing our ministry. So we have these key performance indicators for kingdom work, and This is not how it works. So the point is, I'm just trying to say is, I would much rather have this classroom full than lots and lots of people coming up front and just going out the back. And the reason I'm kind of, a little bit, what's the word, not spiteful, but indignant about it. If all the people who came up in the 40s and 50s for a Billy Graham crusade, all the people in our country, it's our country, overseas measure that differently, but the United States, think of the hundreds of thousands that walked up and received Christ. Then the 1960s should never have happened, but they did. The church was, if they were saved, if they were real salvations, let's say they all were, I don't want to get into that, I mean, that's between them and God, only they know. But say they were real Christians and they just became the shallow Christians that had nothing to offer. And the hippies and the Buddhists and the mystics and the drug mystics and all of that. I mean, the 60s, man, we got hit hard, didn't we? It was just one after another of things that were coming at the church. You had Francis Schaeffer, pretty much it. He was the only one that, on the popular level, that seemed to be addressing these things. In the colleges, you started to see some things turn around. But that's my observation. I don't know if that's fair. I think there's something to it. That don't stop preaching the gospel ever. Don't stop doing altar calls. I'm not saying that at all. But I want to get more excited about the discipleship than, or just as excited, how's that, at discipleship as I do at conversions. Because we're losing more than we're keeping. We're not saving people fast enough to make up for the 75% that are leaving when they get to be 18 years old, leaving the church. So we can't save, it seems like we aren't able to save our way out of this thing. So let's just plug that hole on the back end.
I would argue it's the opposite. I think we're saving money, we're not discipling him.
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
Yes, and I think, I agree with what you're saying. I'm probably the more leaning to the belief that they probably were saved, but they were just shallow Christians with no, I mean, what does Paul call them, those saved as if from fire?
Which gets them to heaven.
Yeah.
If they are saved, and it's just because they want fire insurance, it's like, well, okay, I mean,
Yeah.
if that's not a bad motivation. Who wants to go to hell, right? So
Jesus used that motivation. You know?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But that's it.
That's what I'm saying, you know. I was
But you
like,
grew
Yeah.
afterwards. So yeah, that's the difference. Is that's if we could just do a better job discipling, then we wouldn't lose 75% of the people, and then the salvations that keep happening would mean something. We would have churches that weren't just growing in number, but they would be going out there making a difference. And our church is awesome. We do such a good job.